Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 597, 5 Great Deeds. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I'm exactly the same as I was at the end of last week. Da-dun-dun. I have nothing extra for you because, yeah, it's the same day. I haven't done anything extra. So, so much for that. Anyway, we have 5 chapters today. I just had to keep going for you. Some of these chapters are very short and some not so short, but either way, it was important for me to get to the last chapter today. It's kind of a good place to pause. So again, we have a lot of warifying going on in our chapters, and we have a lot of names and a lot of battle things that get discussed, talked about, explained, dramatized in front of us. So I'm going to try and preset you with everything you need without confusing you, because I actually did get confused myself at several points in here, and I had to go back and figure out where I had gotten off track. So these are chapters that you may find yourself wanting to re-listen to, a couple of them. In particular, chapters 29, 30, and 32. 31 and 33 are a little short, but 29, 30, and 32, I had to look at more than a few times. So names to listen for, because pricking up your ears when you hear these names mentioned will help, I think, keep you on track. So, we have our normal cast of characters. We have Lahir, we have the Bastard of Orleans, we have Joan. And then over on the bad guy side, there's Tremouet, who is just a bad guy. The end. So he gets brought up several times as having, as we've known from before, kind of steering the Dauphin in not such smart directions. One of those directions that the Dauphin was steered in was to stop listening to the Constable of France. His name was Richemont, Richemont. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a good guy. And Joan knew that. Anybody who Tremouet didn't like was probably a good guy to have on your side. So that's all fine and good. But if you are loyal to the Dauphin and the Dauphin says, this dude, the Constable of France, don't play nice with him, that's going to be an issue for somebody like the Bastard of Orleans, who is nobility. He's going to have a little trouble not obeying what the Dauphin's instructions are. So there's some talk off and on throughout today's chapters where this becomes a thing. All you need to remember is Richemont, the Constable of France, good guy, and in many ways makes the success that they had the success that they had. So there's that. On the British side, we have Talbot and Fastolf. These are 2 of the commanding officers on the British side. Talbot, Talbot, and Fastolf. I keep thinking it's a mispronunciation or a misspelling of Falstaff. That is not true. It is Fastolfe. Talbot and Falstaff are working in conjunction with each other and determining who's going to show up where and when. So that's information to pay attention to. In chapter 30, towards the beginning, we have a little French thrown in for us for some verisimilitude. Nenni in nom de Dieu, which is nay, in God's name. And then that's from Joan. And then Joan goes on saying what she's going to say. So if you hear the French, it just means in God's name. No. Talbot in chapter 30 is marching his men towards Joan. in 3 distinct groups: an advance guard, an artillery, and a battle corps. The battle corps is being led, it's in the back, and it's being led by John Fastolf. So they are coming up from the rear, the battle corps. So they are not with Talbot at the beginning of the fighting in chapter 30. They come up from the rear, the battle corps, at a gallop. The French are also heading towards Talbot, obviously from the other side, from our side, also at a run. There are, there's the artillery and the advance guard in between them. To those guys in the middle, that's going to look like a problem. And it does. And that is one of the things that confused the heck out of me, because those 2 forces running at these poor guys in the middle, the artillery and the advance guard, is what helps France take that particular battle and win, hands down, win. I hope that helps make this section clearer for you. It was very confusing for me for a while. I had to really go in and dissect this. So it goes by quickly. It all takes place in less than the totality of a page. So fingers crossed. There is a discussion at the end of chapter 30 about a poor soldier too poor to pay a ransom. I found a website that described the cost of ransoms in the 100 Years' War. The costs were extraordinary. If you were nobility, it was thousands, plural, of pounds. Geoffrey Chaucer got captured when he was out, quote unquote, foraging, and he, not being nobility or a knight or anything nifty like that, was ransomed for 16 pounds. Really, really small potatoes compared to what people of higher rank would have been ransomed for. Generally, if you were kind of in the middle of the pack, you didn't necessarily have your own land or your own passive income at the time, the king would often cover the cost of the ransom for you. Here we have a soldier who is not important enough to get covered by the king, and also not wealthy enough to be able to pay the French captors a ransom so that they would let him go. This whole process of ransoming functioned in 2 ways. One, it made some money for the winning side, which was nifty. And 2, it prevented the winning side from having to keep prisoners of war and feed and house them, which was expensive. So it's a process that made a lot of sense at the time, unless, of course, you didn't have the money, and then you're kind of really out of luck. So there is a story at the end of chapter 30 that is true and that is documented. And in fact, you will hear a footnote in that regard as well. Oh, and there is also a term that I, again, had not heard of before. Poursuivant, P-O-U-R-S-U-I-V-A-N-T. I have seen it spelled other ways. That is the way it is spelled in the original Twain text. It basically means a petitioner. It's someone who is requesting something or pursues, poursuivant, pursues after something. They want something out of the person that they are petitioning, basically. That's all it is. Oh, and I misspoke. It was 29 and 30 that I had to work at to understand all the fighting. Chapters 31, 32, and 33 are not particularly long, but they are important. 31 details that this is the end of the 100 Years' War and how awesome Joan is. Chapter 32 ends with a funny bit about Talbot, again, true. And chapter 33 presets some of the rest of the book, as well as reflects upon what has already been accomplished and kind of puts it all into context for us. So it's a moment to step out of the narrative of the story and, like a good teacher, reinforce the lessons we have learned so far. What have we learned? Joan is awesome. And Louis de Camp says there are 5 great deeds that Joan will have accomplished by the time she's done. And we've seen 2 of them up close and personal so far. We have seen the beginning of a third, and we know that the last two are coming. And that's where we get to next week. So that has set you up, I think, to be able to not have the difficulty that I had with these chapters. God willing, and the creeks don't rise. All right, let's listen to chapters 29, 30, 31, 32, and 33 of Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 29, Fierce Talbot Reconsiders. I knew she had seen the vision of the tree, but when? I could not know. Doubtless before she had lately told the king to use her, for that she had but 1 year left to work in. It had not occurred to me at the time, but the conviction came upon me now that at that time she had already seen the tree. It had brought her a welcome message, that was plain. Otherwise she could not have been so joyous and light-hearted as she had been these latter days. The death warning had nothing dismal about it for her. No, it was remission of exile, it was leave to come home. Yes, she had seen the tree. No one had taken the prophecy to heart which she made to the king, and for a good reason, no doubt. No one wanted to take it to heart. All wanted to banish it away and forget it, and all had succeeded, and would go on to the end placid and comfortable. All but me alone. I must carry my awful secret without any to help me. A heavy load, a bitter burden, and would cost me a daily heartbreak. She was to die, and so soon. I had never dreamed of that. How could I? And she so strong and fresh and young, and every day earning a new right to a peaceful and honored old age. For at that time I thought old age was valuable. I do not know why, but I thought so. All young people think it, I believe, they being ignorant and full of superstitions. She had seen the tree. All that miserable night those ancient verses went floating back and forth through my brain. And when in exile wandering we shall fainting yearn for glimpse of thee, oh, rise upon our sight. But at dawn the bugles and the drums burst through the dreamy hush of the morning, and it was turn out all, mount and ride, for there was red work to be done. We marched to Meung without halting. There we carried the bridge by assault, and left a force to hold it, the rest of the army marching away next morning toward Beaugency, where the lion Talbot, the terror of the French, was in command. When we arrived at that place, the English retired into the castle, and we sat down in the abandoned town. Talbot was not at the moment present in person, for he had gone away to watch for and welcome Fastolf and his reinforcement of 5,000 men. Joan placed her batteries and bombarded the castle till night. Then some news came. Richemont, Constable of France, this long time in disgrace with the king, largely because of the evil machinations of La Trémouille and his party, was approaching with a large body of men to offer his services to Joan, and very much she needed them, now that Fastolf was so close by. Richemont had wanted to join us before, when we first marched on Orleans, but the foolish king, slave of those paltry advisers of his, warned him to keep his distance, and refused all reconciliation with him. I go into these details because they are important. Important because they lead up to the exhibition of a new gift in Joan's extraordinary mental make-up: statesmanship. It is a sufficiently strange thing to find that great quality in an ignorant country girl of 17 and a half, but she had it. Joan was for receiving Richemont cordially, and so was La Hire and the two young Laval and other chiefs, but the Lieutenant-General d'Alençon strenuously and stubbornly opposed it. He said he had absolute orders from the king to deny and defy Richemont, and that if they were overridden he would leave the army. This would have been a heavy disaster indeed, but Joan set herself the task of persuading him that the salvation of France took precedence of all minor things, even the commands of a sceptered ass, and she accomplished it. She persuaded him to disobey the king in the interest of the nation, and to be reconciled to Count Richemont and welcome him. That was statesmanship, and of the highest and soundest sort. Whatever thing men call great, look for it in Joan of Arc, and there you will find it. In the early morning, June 17th, the scouts reported the approach of Talbot and Fastolf with Fastolf's succoring force. Then the drums beat to arms, and we set forth to meet the English, leaving Richemont and his troops behind to watch the castle of Beaugency and keep its garrison at home. By and by we came in sight of the enemy. Fastolf had tried to convince Talbot that it would be wisest to retreat and not risk a battle with Joan at this time, but distribute the new levies among the English strongholds of the Loire, thus securing them against capture. Then be patient and wait for more levies from Paris. Let Joan exhaust her army with fruitless daily skirmishing, then at the right time fall upon her in resistless mass and annihilate her. He was a wise old experienced general, was Fastolf, but that fierce Talbot would hear of no delay. He was in a rage over the punishment which the Maid had inflicted upon him at Orleans and since, and he swore by God and St. George that he would have it out with her if he had to fight her all alone. So Fastolf yielded, though he said they were now risking the loss of everything which the English had gained by so many years' work and so many hard knocks. The enemy had taken up a strong position and were waiting, in order of battle, with their archers to the front and a stockade before them. Night was coming on. A messenger came from the English with a rude defiance and an offer of battle, but Joan's dignity was not ruffled, her bearing was not discomposed. She said to the herald, "Go back and say it is too late to meet tonight, but tomorrow, please God and Our Lady, we will come to close quarters." The night fell dark and rainy. It was that sort of light, steady rain which falls so softly and brings to one's spirit such serenity and peace. About 10 o'clock, d'Alençon, the bastard of Orleans, La Hire, Poton of Cetray, and 2 or 3 other generals came to our headquarters tent, and sat down to discuss matters with Joan. Some thought it was a pity that Joan had declined battle, some thought not. Then Poton asked her why she had declined it. She said, "There was more than one reason. These English are ours. They cannot get away from us. Wherefore there is no need to take risks, as at other times. The day was far spent. It is good to have much time and the fair light of day, when one's force is in a weakened state. 900 of us yonder keeping the bridge of Meung under the Marshal de Rais, 1,500 with the Constable of France keeping the bridge and watching the castle of Beaugency." Dunois said, "I grieve for this decision, Excellency, but it cannot be helped, and the case will be the same the morrow as to that." Joan was walking up and down just then. She laughed her affectionate, comradey laugh, and stopping before that old war-tiger, she put her small hand above his head and touched one of his plumes, saying, "Now tell me, wise man, which feather is it that I touch?" "In sooth, Excellency, that I cannot." "Name of God, bastard, bastard! You cannot tell me this small thing, yet are bold to name a large one, telling us what is in the stomach of the unborn morrow, that we shall not have those men. Now it is my thought that they will be with us." That made a stir. All wanted to know why she thought that, but La Hire took the word and said, "Let be. If she thinks it, that is enough. It will happen." Then Poton of Cetray said, "There were other reasons for declining battle, according to the saying of your Excellency?" "Yes. One was that, we being weak in the day far gone, the battle might not be decisive. When it is fought it must be decisive, and it shall be." "God grant it, and amen. There were still other reasons?" "One other, yes." She hesitated a moment, then said, "This was not the day. Tomorrow is the day. It is so written." They were going to assail her with eager questionings, but she put up her hand and prevented them, and then she said, "It will be the most noble and beneficent victory that God has vouchsafed for France at any time. I pray you question me not as to whence or how I know this thing, but be content that it is so." There was pleasure in every face, and conviction and high confidence. A murmur of conversation broke out, but that was interrupted by a messenger from the outposts who brought news, namely, that for an hour there had been stir and movement in the English camp of a sort unusual at such a time, and with a resting army, he said. Spies had been sent under cover of the rain and darkness to inquire into it. They had just come back and reported that large bodies of men had been dimly made out who were slipping stealthily away in the direction of Meung. The generals were very much surprised, as any might tell from their faces. "It is a retreat," said Joan. "It has that look," said d'Alençon. "It certainly has," observed the Bastard and La Hire. "It was not to be expected," said Louis de Bourbon, "but one can divine the purpose of it." "Yes," responded Joan. "Talbot has reflected. His rash brain has cooled. He thinks to take the bridge of Meung and escape to the other side of the river. He knows that this leaves his garrison of Beaugency at the mercy of fortune, to escape our hands if it can, but there is no other course if he would avoid this battle, and that he also knows. But he shall not get the bridge, we will see to that." "Yes," said d'Alençon, "we must follow him and take care of that matter. What of Beaugency?" "Leave Beaugency to me, gentle Duke. I will have it in 2 hours, and at no cost of blood." "It is true, Excellency. You will but need to deliver this news there, and receive the surrender." "Yes, and I will be with you at Meung with the dawn, fetching the constable and his 1,500, and when Talbot knows that Beaugency has fallen, it will have an effect upon him." "By the mass, yes," cried La Hire. "He will join his Meung garrison to his army and break for Paris. Then we shall have our bridge force with us again, along with our Beaugency watchers, and be stronger for our great day's work by 24,000 able soldiers, as was here promised within the hour. Verily, this Englishman is doing our errands for us and saving us much blood and trouble. Orders, Excellency, give us orders." "They are simple. Let the men rest 3 hours longer. At 1 o'clock the advance guard will march, under our command, with Poton of Saintré as second. The second division will follow at 2 under the lieutenant general. Keep well in the rear of the enemy, and see to it that you avoid an engagement. I will ride under guard to Beaugency, and make so quick work there that I and the Constable of France will join you before dawn with his men." She kept her word. Her guard mounted, and we rode off through the puttering rain, taking with us a captured English officer to confirm Joan's news. We soon covered the journey, and summoned the castle. Richard Guertin, Talbot's lieutenant, being convinced that he and his 500 men were left helpless, conceded that it would be useless to try to hold out. He could not expect easy terms, yet Joan granted them nevertheless. His garrison could keep their horses and arms, and carry away property to the value of a silver mark per man. They could go whither they pleased, but must not take arms against France again under 10 days. Before dawn we were with our army again, and with us the constable and nearly all his men, for we left only a small garrison in Beaugency Castle. We heard the dull booming of cannon to the front, and knew that Talbot was beginning his attack on the bridge. But some time before it was yet light, the sound ceased, and we heard it no more. Guertin had sent a messenger through our lines, under a safe conduct, given by Joan, to tell Talbot of the surrender. Of course this poursuivant had arrived ahead of us. Talbot had held it wisdom to turn now and retreat upon Paris. When daylight came, he had disappeared, and with him Lord Scales and the garrison of Meung. What a harvest of English strongholds we had reaped in those 3 days, strongholds which had defied France with quite cool confidence and plenty of it until we came. End of chapter 29. Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 30, The Red Field of Pate. When the morning broke at last, on that forever memorable 18th of June, there was no enemy discoverable anywhere, as I have said. But that did not trouble me. I knew we should find him, and that we should strike him the promised blow, the one from which the English power in France would not rise up in 1,000 years, as Joan had said in her trance. The enemy had plunged into the wide plains of La Beauce, a roadless waste covered with bushes, with here and there bodies of forest trees, a region where an army would be hidden from view in a very little while. We found the trail in the soft, wet earth and followed it. It indicated an orderly march, no confusion, no panic. But we had to be cautious. In such a piece of country we could walk into an ambush without any trouble. Therefore Joan sent bodies of cavalry ahead under La Hire, Poton, and other captains, to feel the way. Some of the other officers began to show uneasiness. This sort of Hide-and-go-seek business troubled them and made their confidence a little shaky. Joan divined their state of mind, and cried out impetuously, "Name of God, what would you? We must smite these English, and we will. They shall not escape us. Though they were hung to the clouds, we would get them." By and by we were nearing Pate. It was about a league away. Now at this time our reconnaissance, feeling its way in the bush, frightened a deer, and it went bounding away and was out of sight in a moment. Then hardly a minute later a dull great shout went up in the distance toward Pate. It was the English soldiery. They had been shut up in a garrison so long on mouldy food that they could not keep their delight to themselves when this fine fresh meat came springing into their midst. Poor creature, it had wrought damage to a nation which loved it well, for the French knew where the English were now, whereas the English had no suspicion of where the French were. La Hire halted where he was, and sent back the tidings. Joan was radiant with joy. The Duke d'Alençon said to her, "Very well, we have found them. Shall we fight them?" "Have you good spurs, Prince?" "Why, will they make us run away?" "Nenny, oh nom de Dieu, these English are ours. They are lost. They will fly. Who overtakes them will need good spurs. Forward, close up." By the time we had come up with La Hire, the English had discovered our presence. Talbot's force was marching in 3 bodies, first his advance guard, then his artillery, then his battle corps a good way in the rear. He was now out of the bush and in a fair open country. He had at once posted his artillery, his advance guard, and 500 picked archers along some hedges where the French would be obliged to pass, and hoped to hold this position till his battle corps could come up. Sir John Fastolfe urged the battle corps into a gallop. Joan saw her opportunity, and ordered La Hire to advance, which La Hire promptly did, launching his wild riders like a stormy wind, his customary fashion. The Duke and the Bastard wanted to follow, but Joan said, "Not yet, wait." So they waited, impatiently, and fidgeting in their saddles. But she was ready, gazing straight before her, measuring, weighing, calculating, by shades, minutes, fractions of minutes, seconds, with all her great soul present in eye and set of head and noble pose of body, but patient, steady, master of herself and of the situation. And yonder, receding, plumes lifting and falling, streamed the thundering charge of La Hire's godless crew, La Hire's great figure dominating it, and his sword stretched aloft like a flagstaff. "Oh, Satan and his hellions, see them go!" somebody muttered in a deep admiration. And now he was closing up on Fastolfe's rushing corps. And now he struck it hard and broke its order. It lifted the Duke and the Bastard in their saddles to see it, and they turned, trembling with excitement, to Joan, saying, "Now!" But she put up her hand, still gazing, weighing, calculating, and said again, "Wait, not yet." Fastolfe's hard-driven battle corps raged on like an avalanche toward the waiting advance guard. Suddenly these conceived the idea that it was flying in panic before Joan, and so in that instant it broke and swarmed away in a mad panic itself, with Talbot storming and cursing after it. Now was the golden time. Joan drove her spurs home and waved the advance with her sword. "Follow me!" she cried, and bent her head to her horse's neck and sped away like the wind. We went down into the confusion of that flying rout, and for 3 long hours we cut and hacked and stabbed. At last the bugles sang halt. The battle of Pate was won. Joan of Arc dismounted, and stood surveying that awful field, lost in thought. Presently she said, "The praise is to God. He has smitten with a heavy hand this day." After a little she lifted her face, and looked afar off, said, with the manner of one who is thinking aloud, "In 1,000 years, the English power in France will not rise up from this blow." She stood again a time thinking. Then she turned toward her grouped generals, and there was a glory in her face and a noble light in her eye, and she said, "Oh, friends, do you know? Do you comprehend? France is on the way to be free." "And had never been but for Joan of Arc," said La Hire, passing before her and bowing low, the others following and doing likewise, he muttering as he went, "I will say it, though I be damned for it." Then battalion after battalion of our victorious army swung by, wildly cheering, and they shouted, "Live forever, Maid of Orleans! Live forever!" while Joan, smiling, stood at the salute with her sword. This was not the last time I saw the Maid of Orleans on the red field of Pate. Toward the end of the day I came upon her where the dead and dying lay stretched all about in heaps and winrows. Our men had mortally wounded an English prisoner who was too poor to pay a ransom, and from a distance she had seen that cruel thing done, and had galloped to the place and sent for a priest, and now she was holding the head of her dying enemy in her lap, and easing him to his death with comforting soft words, just as his sister might have done, and the womanly tears running down her face all the time. Footnote 1. Lord Ronald Gower, Joan of Arc, page 82, says, Michelet discovered this story in the deposition of Joan of Arc's page Louis de Conte, who was probably an eye-witness of the scene. This is true. It was a part of the testimony of the author of these Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, given by him in the rehabilitation proceedings of 1456. Translator. End of Note 1. End of Chapter 30. Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 31, France Begins to Live Again. Joan had said true. France was on the way to be free. The war, called the 100 Years' War, was very sick today, sick on its English side, for the very first time since its birth, 91 years gone by. Shall we judge battles by the numbers killed and the ruin wrought? Or shall we not rather judge them by the results which flowed from them? Anyone will say that a battle is only truly great or small according to its results. Yes, anyone will grant that, for it is the truth. Judged by results, Pate's place is with the few supremely great and imposing battles that have been fought since the peoples of the world first resorted to arms for the settlement of their quarrels. So judged, it is even possible that Pate has no peer among that few just mentioned, but stands alone as the supremest of historic conflicts. For when it began, France lay gasping out the remnant of an exhausted life, her case wholly hopeless in the view of all political physicians. When it ended, 3 hours later, she was convalescent. Convalescent, and nothing requisite but time and ordinary nursing to bring her back to perfect health. The dullest physician of them all could see this, and there was none to deny it. Many death-sick nations have reached convalescence through a series of battles, a procession of battles, a weary tale of wasting conflicts stretching over years, but only one has reached it in a single day and by a single battle. That nation is France, and that battle Pate. Remember it and be proud of it, for you are French, and it is the stateliest fact in the long annals of your country. There it stands, with its head in the clouds. And when you grow up you will go on pilgrimage to the field of Pate, and stand uncovered in the presence of what? A monument with its head in the clouds? Yes, for all nations in all times have built monuments on their battlefields to keep green the memory of the perishable deed that was wrought there, and of the perishable name of him who wrought it. And will France neglect Pate and Joan of Arc? Not for long. And will she build a monument scaled to their rank as compared with the world's other fields and heroes? Perhaps, if there be room for it under the arch of the sky. But let us look back a little, and consider certain strange and impressive facts. The 100 Years' War began in 1337. It raged on and on, year after year and year after year, and at last England stretched France prone with that fearful blow at Crécy. But she rose and struggled on year after year, and at last again she went down under another devastating blow, Poitiers. She gathered her crippled strength once more, and the war raged on, and still on, year after year, decade after decade. Children were born, grew up, married, died. The war raged on. Their children in turn grew up, married, died. The war raged on. Their children, growing, saw France struck down again, this time under the incredible disaster of Agincourt. And still the war raged on, year after year, and in time these children married in their turn. France was a wreck, a ruin, a desolation. The half of it belonged to England, with none to dispute or deny the truth. The other half belonged to nobody. In 3 months would be flying the English flag, the French king was making ready to throw away his crown and flee beyond the seas. Now came the ignorant country maid out of her remote village and confronted this hoary war, this all-consuming conflagration that had swept the land for 3 generations. Then began the briefest and most amazing campaign that is recorded in history. In 7 weeks it was finished. In 7 weeks she hopelessly crippled that gigantic war that was 91 years old. At Orleans she struck it a staggering blow. On the field of Pate she broke its back. Think of it. Yes, one can do that, but understand it? Ah, that is another matter. None will ever be able to comprehend that stupefying marvel. 7 weeks, with here and there a little bloodshed, perhaps the most of it in any single fight at Pate, where the English began 6,000 strong and left 2,000 dead upon the field. It is said and believed that in 3 battles alone, Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, near 100,000 Frenchmen fell, without counting the 1,000 other fights of that long war. The dead of that war make a mournful long list, an interminable list. Of men slain in the field the count goes by tens of thousands. Of innocent women and children slain by bitter hardship and hunger it goes by that appalling term, millions. It was an ogre, that war, an ogre that went about for near 100 years, crunching men and dripping blood from its jaws, and with her little hand that child of 17 struck him down, and yonder he lies stretched on the field of Pate, and will not get up any more while this old world lasts. End of chapter 31. Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 32, The Joyous News Flies Fast. The great news of Pate was carried over the whole of France in 20 hours, people said. I do not know as to that, but one thing is sure anyway. The moment a man got it he flew shouting and glorifying God and told his neighbor, and that neighbor flew with it to the next homestead, and so on, without resting the word traveled. And when a man got it in the night, at what hour soever, he jumped out of his bed and bore the blessed message along, and the joy that went with it was like the light that flows across the land when an eclipse is receding from the face of the sun. And, indeed, you may say that France had lain in an eclipse this long time, yes, buried in a black gloom which these beneficent tidings were sweeping away now before the onrush of their white splendor. The news beat the flying enemy to Yeovil, and the town rose against its English masters and shut the gates against their brethren. It flew to Montpipeau, to Saint-Simon, and to this, that, and the other English fortress, and straightway the garrison applied the torch and took to the fields and the woods. A detachment of our army occupied Meung and pillaged it. When we reached Orleans, that town was as much as 50 times insaner with joy than we had ever seen it before, which is saying much. Night had just fallen, and the illuminations were on so wonderful a scale that we seemed to plow through seas of fire. And as to the noise, the hoarse cheering of the multitude, the thundering of cannon, the clash of bells, indeed, there was never anything like it. And everywhere rose a new cry that burst upon us like a storm when the column entered the gates, and never more ceased. "Welcome to Joan of Arc! Way for the Savior of France!" And there was another cry, "Crécy is avenged! Poitiers is avenged! Agincourt is avenged! Pate shall live forever!" Mad? Why, you never could imagine it in the world. The prisoners were in the center of the column. When that came along, and the people caught sight of their masterful old enemy Talbot, that had made them dance so long to his grim war music, you may imagine what the uproar was like if you can, for I cannot describe it. They were so glad to see him that presently they wanted to have him out and hang him. So Joan had him brought up to the front to ride in her protection. They made a striking pair. End of chapter 32. Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 33, Joan's 5 Great Deeds. Yes, Orleans was in a delirium of felicity. She invited the king and made sumptuous preparations to receive him, but he didn't come. He was simply a serf at that time, and La Tremouille was his master. Master and serf were visiting together at the master's castle of Sully-sur-Loire. At Beaugency, Joan had engaged to bring about a reconciliation between the constable Richemont and the king. She took Richemont to Sully-sur-Loire and made her promise good. The great deeds of Joan of Arc are 5. 1. The raising of the siege. 2. The victory of Pate. 3. The reconciliation at Sully-sur-Loire. 4. The coronation of the king. 5. The bloodless march. We shall come to the bloodless march presently, and the coronation. It was the victorious long march which Joan made through the enemy's country from Gien to Rheims, and thence to the gates of Paris, capturing every English town and fortress that barred the road from the beginning of the journey to the end of it, and this by the mere force of her name, and without shedding a drop of blood, perhaps the most extraordinary campaign in this regard in history. This is the most glorious of her military exploits. The reconciliation was one of Joan's most important achievements. No one else could have accomplished it, and, in fact, no one else of high consequence had any disposition to try. In brains, in scientific warfare, and in statesmanship, the Constable Richemont was the ablest man in France. His loyalty was sincere, his probity was above suspicion, and it made him sufficiently conspicuous in that trivial and conscienceless court. In restoring Richemont to France, Joan made thoroughly secure the successful completion of the great work which she had begun. She had never seen Richemont until he came to her with his little army. Was it not wonderful that at a glance she should know him for the one man who could finish and perfect her work and establish it in perpetuity? How was it that that child was able to do this? It was because she had the seeing eye, as one of her knights had once said. Yes, she had that great gift, almost the highest and rarest that has been granted to man. Nothing of an extraordinary sort was still to be done, yet the remaining work could not safely be left to the king's idiots, for it would require wise statesmanship, and long and patient, though desultory, hammering of the enemy. Now and then, for a quarter of a century yet, there would be a little fighting to do, and a handy man could carry that on with small disturbance to the rest of the country. And little by little, and with progressive certainty, the English would disappear from France. And that happened. Under the influence of Richemont, the king became at a later time a man, a king, a brave and capable and determined soldier. Within 6 years after Pate, he was leading storming parties himself, fighting in fortress ditches up to his waist in water, and climbing scaling ladders under a furious fire with a pluck that would have satisfied even Joan of Arc. In time he and Richemont cleared away all the English, even from regions where the people had been under their mastership for 300 years. In such regions wise and careful work was necessary, for the English rule had been fair and kindly, and men who have been ruled in that way are not always anxious for a change. Which of Joan's 5 chief deeds shall we call the chiefest? It is my thought that each in its turn was that. This is saying that, taken as a whole, they equalized each other, and neither was then greater than its mate. Do you perceive? Each was a stage in an ascent. To leave out one of them would defeat the journey. To achieve one of them at the wrong time and in the wrong place would have the same effect. Consider the coronation. As a masterpiece of diplomacy, where can you find its superior in our history? Did the king suspect its vast importance? No. Did his ministers? No. Did the astute Bedford, representative of the English crown? No. An advantage of incalculable importance was here under the eyes of the king and of Bedford. The king could get it by a bold stroke, Bedford could get it without an effort. But, being ignorant of its value, neither of them put forth his hand. Of all the wise people in high office in France, only one knew the priceless worth of this neglected prize, the untaught child of 17, Joan of Arc. And she had known it from the beginning as an essential detail of her mission. How did she know it? It was simple. She was a peasant. That tells the whole story. She was of the people and knew the people. Those others moved in a loftier sphere and knew nothing much about them. We make little account of that vague, formless, inert mass, that mighty underlying force which we call the people, an epithet which carries contempt with it. It is a strange attitude, for at bottom we know that the throne which the people support stands, and that when that support is removed nothing in this world can save it. Now then, consider this fact, and observe its importance. Whatever the parish priest believes his flock believes. They love him, they revere him. He is their unfailing friend, their dauntless protector, their comforter in sorrow, their helper in their day of need. He has their whole confidence, and what he tells them to do, that they will do, with a blind and affectionate obedience, let it cost what it may. Add these facts thoughtfully together, and what is the sum? This: the parish priest governs the nation. What is the king, then, if the parish priest withdraws his support and deny his authority? Merely a shadow and no king. Let him resign. Do you get that idea? Then let us proceed. A priest is consecrated to his office by the awful hand of God, laid upon him by his appointed representative on earth. That consecration is final. Nothing can undo it, nothing can remove it. Neither the Pope nor any other power can strip the priest of his office. God gave it, and it is forever sacred and secure. The dull parish knows all this. To priest and parish whatsoever is anointed of God bears an office whose authority can no longer be disputed or assailed. To the parish priest, and to his subjects, the nation, an uncrowned king is a similitude of a person who has been named for holy orders, but has not been consecrated. He has no office. He has not been ordained. Another may be appointed to his place. In a word, an uncrowned king is a doubtful king. But if God appoint him and his servant the bishop anoint him, the doubt is annihilated. The priest and the parish are his loyal subjects straightway, and while he lives they will recognize no king but him. To Joan of Arc, the peasant girl, Charles VII was no king until he was crowned. To her he was only the Dauphin, that is to say, the heir. If I have ever made her call him king, it was a mistake. She called him the Dauphin, and nothing else, until after the coronation. It shows you as in a mirror, for Joan was a mirror in which the lowly hosts of France were clearly reflected, that to all that vast underlying force called the people, he was no king, but only Dauphin before his crowning, and was indisputably and irrevocably king after it. Now you understand what a colossal move on the political chessboard the coronation was. Bedford realized this by and by, and tried to patch up his mistake by crowning his king. But what good could that do? None in the world. Speaking of chess, Joan's great acts may be likened to that game. Each move was made in its proper order, and it was great and effective because it was made in its proper order and not out of it. Each, at the time made, seemed the greatest move, but the final result made them all recognizable as equally essential and equally important. This is the game as played. 1. Joan moves to Orleans and Pate. Check. 2. Then moves the reconciliation, but does not proclaim check, it being a move for position and to take effect later. 3. Next she moves the coronation. Check. 4. Next the bloodless march. Check. 5. Final move, after her death, the reconciled Constable Richemont to the French king's elbow. Checkmate.
All right. So, again, we can see why, if you had a choice, you would want to surrender to Joan. There are several other places where we learn of things that Joan did for prisoners, not necessarily French prisoners either. She's extraordinary. The documentation of the end of the 100 Years' War, I thought was powerful. Generation after generation growing up in this. And Joan is part of those generations and yet is able to be merciful and kind to the enemy when they are poor and in need and dying. It's just awesome. I loved the end of 32. They were so glad to see Talbot that they wanted to take him out and hang him. And again, under other leadership, it's very possible that they would have just handed the British guy over to the crowd and let them have their way with him. And Joan, nope, have him come up and ride next to me. We're going to keep this guy safe. That's what you do. And then the 5 great deeds of Joan. A lot of time is spent here on Richemont and how important he was. He was important in these fights that we've just gone through because he maintained security. They didn't have to worry about what they were leaving behind falling back into British hands because they knew he was there. And Joan, in her new role of statesmanship, or new activity of statesmanship, she did a good thing. She did a really good thing in getting Richemont back in place. And it was nice to hear that at some point in the future, the king is going to stop being a toad and get his act together. So that is a happifying thing as well. I also really loved the moment where Twain kind of breaks in and says, I mean, it's Louis de Camp breaking in, but it really is Twain breaking in. If I've ever made Joan call him king, that was my mistake. She never did. He is the Dauphin until he is crowned. And I thought that was kind of cool and kind of smart for somebody who was writing it as chapters for publication. Just in case I screwed up back there somewhere in the past in something that I can't change right now. My fault, not hers. So we are now set up. We know more of what's coming. We haven't won the day yet. We haven't gotten to the coronation yet. We are closing in on it though. And that's coming up very soon. So you have a great time. Take care. Be well. Be safe. Be good to each other. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.